We are talking today with Mr. Eric Berkowitz, the author of The Boundaries of Desire, A Century of Good Sex, Bad Laws, and Changing Identities. Welcome to Redera.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Obviously, societies have been evolving, and the perceptions and our degrees of comfort also have been changing. What is the main theme of the book?
Well, I think there's probably several main themes, but one of the main themes of the book is that what seems to be, timeless moral values are actually pretty temporary. And with respect to the rules governing sexual behavior, it really, one's restrictions depend quite a bit on where one is and what class one belongs to and what decade one happens to be living in. And I really was trying to highlight how quickly shifting the rules are and how they often serve political expedience. So, for example, the United States rethought its racial policies over the years. Its rules on sex between the races and among the races changed along with it. Although the change is never particularly neat, and sometimes the courts are behind the times, sometimes the courts are ahead of the times. It's often pretty random. And I think one of the things else that I also tried to show are the forces that affect the laws about sex, be it religion, be it science, be it hard science or soft science such as psychology, etc., that there's, often several different forces working at once on any particular rule. And then, of course, we, have to see whether rules are followed and who gets punished when they're not.
In the book, you deal with some very important issues. One of the most important things is home, marriage, and
yes.
And if you would explain a little bit how you treat that in the book, from the socially acceptable ways, what it used to be, what it is now, and where the law is today compared to where it was several years ago or a decade ago.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I approached was the whole notion of family values, that being a clarion call for the far right, of trying to return to some mythic period where families decided what the rules are for children and what the rules are for one another, and get government off our backs. But the truth is that as I began to research this, I realized that that's the last thing that we want. At the early part of the 20th century, which is where Boundaries begins, the family home was a very dangerous place for the weaker members involved. Men were permitted to rape their wives, for example. In fact, the whole notion of a man raping his wife was considered to be ludicrous. That's a holdover from a very long-standing doctrine that women were essentially the property of their husbands. So women didn't even really have any particular agency with respect to their husbands. And the notion that a woman could resist sexual interest by her husband or even refuse her husband had not come close to being part of the law yet. In fact, it didn't really, that whole thing, the rape your wife privilege, or what they call the marital rape exemption, wasn't really undone in this country until the late 80s. And that whole notion of a woman's agency, of a woman's, taking ownership of her own body, that theme progressed throughout the 20th century with rape law, with sexual harassment law, etc. But the home was really the center of it. Also, with respect to children, our whole idea of what a child is and what a child's responsibilities are for himself or herself has changed. Children who were molested by their parents or beaten up terribly by their parents really had no recourse whatsoever at the early part of the century. That's, of course, changed. Courts and police are now, not hesitant to jump inside the house and to rule on questions of domestic violence and to rule on child abuse. We've also redefined what a child is, because not long ago, children were considered to be adults sexually at ages 12, 13, 14. We've now raised those ages to 18. Although in many industrialized countries, the ages are still quite a bit lower. The consequences of that have been huge, both for the children and for those who have relations with people 18 and under. So the whole notion of the family and the family home being a bastion that is controlled by the father, and where the government or the law really has no place, has been rethought almost in its entirety. And on the whole, I think that's a very good thing, of course.
So what forces have been driving this thing? Is it there's a more awareness, there is more acceptability, and or people are just getting more and more comfortable, or what are there any forces that are driving these changes that we're all going through of different things that you just mentioned about?
Well, there are many forces, of course. I mean, and it's not, you can't take sex law just as one monolithic subject. One of the main forces that has been affecting sex law generally, but particularly with respect to homosexuality and rape, has been the replacement of priests and rabbis as the arbiters of sexual morality by social scientists. So what were sins evolved somewhere around the turn of the century into mental illnesses. Okay, so whereas someone who had, for example, homosexual sex would be considered to be a sinner at one point, the whole notion of a homosexual being an identity and that identity being considered to be mentally ill, that's new. Okay, and very often when something is classified as a mental illness, you have to beware the cures. Okay, so homosexuality, once it was defined as a mental illness rather than simply a bad thing that one or another person did, then we began to ascribe symptoms to that mental illness. And throughout the 20th century, and really until very recently, the symptoms of that mental illness were held to be child molesting, treason, a lot of very antisocial and very terrible things. And at the same time also, homosexuality as an illness, the next thing that comes is the cure. And a lot of homosexuals, for example, were treated quite badly in mental hospitals. They were subjected to lobotomies and chemical castration, etc. So that force of absorbing sexual behavior in the realm of psychology ends up having very profound effects. Now, homosexuality was taken off the list of mental illnesses back in the 70s, but it still lingered in the popular imagination. The stigma still continued. In fact, it's still legal in most places for parents to deprogram their children, that is, to put them through homosexual cures. And this is another conflict between the rights of the parents and the child's right in and of himself. So whereas homosexuality is no longer considered to be a mental illness, thank God, there still is a holdover that parents have the right to essentially torture their children by curing them. So there's the whole notion of psychology that also affected rape, for example. For the tradition in the law of being hostile to rape victims got a psychological gloss over the century by theories that women deep down inside wanted to be raped, or that women deep down inside liked it, or deep down inside were tempted to it. And these theories that were mainstream psychology and were really eaten whole by the law, to the effect that a lot of women were denied justice. Let's just put it like that. So again, when the Bible determines sexual morality, that's often leads towards terrible results, but at least the Bible doesn't change. Science, on the other hand, changes all the time, and the law moves much more slowly than science. So a certain psychological theory will come up, such as homosexuals are congenital child molesters, which is debunked. That gets absorbed by the law. Science will discard that theory when it's disproven, but the law will tend to hold on to it. So there's a sort of give and take. There's also the main forces in relations between the races, and as civil rights began to take hold and become one of the main goals of the second half of the 20th century to get rid of the holdover restrictions on African Americans and other minorities. We had to shift the sexual laws along with those. There was a scientific theory that Adolf Hitler loved and that was very, very popular here called eugenics, where it was considered to be bad for the white race to mix with the darker races, which is, of course, insane. But that was mainstream science, and that also affected the law. There were laws strictly barring sexual relations in marriage between races, and not just between blacks and whites, between all kinds of races. Again, once these theories get debunked, then we begin to open up a bit. So just to summarize, the loss of religion as an arbiter of morality, the shifting sands of science, racial relations, it goes on.
Very well said. The book is very meticulously researched and very easy to read, and it's not just for the lawyers. It's really for...
I hope not.
It's easy read for people who are interested in this topic,
Yeah, I would think that anyone who reads the paper and sees the sex stories popping up all the time could probably use a little bit of background. Hopefully the book was fun to read, because that's the point.
And let's take the issues of the rape and sexual harassment, one within the bedroom and one outside the bedroom. How the laws have evolved in the last decade?
Well, sexual harassment grew out of the shifting sands of rape law. That as women, particularly in the 70s and 80s, rose up against the fact that rape law was really rigged against them, and that it was almost impossible for women to have their stories believed. As that movement against the marital rape privilege and against the legal rules allowing a woman's entire sexual history to come into court to be used against her, to say that she was promiscuous, and in that way she would lose rape cases. We can talk more about rape, but sexual harassment grew out of that, and it really grew out of the feminist theories that a woman does not have to suffer any kind of invasions of her dignity by men. So it's not just outright sexual assault. It's all of the ways in which women are targeted sexually in society itself. And so the notion of a woman who is attractive and having her attractiveness held against her by somehow inviting rape, it was really a small step to say that they shouldn't have to trade sex to keep their jobs, or that they shouldn't have to suffer groping and things like that in order to remain employed. So starting around 1980 or so, rules began to be adopted protecting women in the workplace against what's called quid pro quo, that is sex for work, or what's called a hostile environment. And so it's hard for us to think of it now, but it really happened, and it still does, but it happened a lot more then, that for a woman, in order to keep her employment or to advance in employment, she would have to trade sexual favors. That was thrown out the window. That can't happen anymore. Also, it grew up that she didn't really have to suffer not necessarily a quid pro quo, but also, any one of 100 other ways in which her sexuality would have to be exploited in order for her to keep her job. Now, the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings much later became what's called a sexual harassment teach-in for the entire country. That was really the first time that the entire country began to put its head around what women had to go through sometimes, even in the face of very powerful men, or maybe we could say particularly in the face of very powerful men, during the course of their work. Now, of course, Anita Hill suffered terribly, and Clarence Thomas became a Supreme Court justice. But I think that really did raise awareness pretty heavily on what happens. So sexual harassment law is very new. It's been developing very, very quickly. It's gone in a lot of different directions. And some would say it's gone to excess in some ways not enough. But we've now pretty well absorbed the notion that the workplace, at least, should be desexualized. At the same time, though, truly, women are made to put up with a lot more in the way of sexual harassment than men are. Men who suffer, for example, homosexual advances at work, we're expected to have very thin skins, and those kinds of cases win all the time. Where it's still quite difficult for a woman to win a sexual harassment case.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how the birth control development obviously probably have given women more agency over their bodies as well.
Well, birth control is a really fascinating issue. I mean, at the beginning of the century, even birth control information was treated as pornography and was to be suppressed. The whole notion of even learning about birth control was considered to be a forbidden subject. And, as the decades passed, we began to open that up, of course, and condoms became more freely available. And the significance of that really is that it really moved along a woman's idea of taking control of her own sexuality, that she can prevent pregnancy, particularly for women who are poor or working class. Wealthier people always have gotten what they wanted, really. Birth control has never been barred by people who can afford it, especially when it's restricted. But as it became more generally available, it allowed women, one, to avoid pregnancy altogether, to support themselves, to not necessarily look to men quite so readily as a meal ticket in addition to as a husband. So the whole notion of sexual autonomy, prevention of pregnancy, allowed women to enter to remain in the workforce longer, to remain healthier longer, and to make very fundamental choices about themselves. And once that happens, other things begin to grow from that. So birth control, of course, also the birth control pill in the early 60s fueled the sexual revolution, which I think we're still recovering from or adjusting to. Once you can simply take a pill every day and not become pregnant at all, then sex became really a matter of choice. And that had huge effects on the morals of the 60s and 70s and the counter reactions to those morals in the 80s and 90s up until now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the stereotype that was held for a long time especially about the black females being the root cause of black poverty, and that changed. And would you explain a little bit how that finally changed, or how the science never really backed that up?
It's an amazing story, I've got to tell you. The class questions come so heavily into this. Coming out of slavery and out of Reconstruction, there was this notion that black women are more promiscuous than white women. It's a complete falsehood, but that really grew out of the fact that that black women were raped by the millions when they were the property of white men. And the notion of black women being promiscuous continued on into the 20s and 30s, and it had a lot of different effects. One of which was as black women began to receive, single black women began to receive public assistance, particularly when they had children, this old stereotype of them being overly promiscuous and having children just to get welfare, et cetera, all that began to be come back. And these are really hateful stereotypes. And so for example, as birth control, what we were just talking about, became readily available, particularly with the pill, and most middle class and upper white women had the choice to participate in the sexual revolution or not. You can give vent to your promiscuity. Black women were actually held to be latent prostitutes. So we began to blame them for having children. And the welfare rules began to be increasingly tightened, that black women, as they have children, can't, receive additional public assistance. So the behavior for white women was set on a completely different set of morals than it was for black women. I've got a story in the book about something called Operation Bed Check in the 60s, where we instituted rules that any black women who were living with a man, or if a man could be found in their homes, that they would be cut off from welfare immediately, and the men that they were with would be forced to pay for their lives. It was just a way to cut off government expenditures. So in Oakland, California, in the mid-60s, one Sunday morning, hundreds of police made surprise visits to black women, and if they saw men there, then they were immediately cut off from all of their benefits, something that would have never happened to white women, ever. And that was actually upheld by the Supreme Court. Well, the notion of surprise visits was struck down by the Supreme Court, but the notion of cutting off black women for having male friends and having men in, quote, men in the house, those rules were upheld for quite a long time. So a black woman who has sex out of marriage or even entertains a man outside of marriage has to pay for that by losing support for her children. Very, very, very brutal stuff.
It all sounds ridiculous.
The welfare queen, you know?
Yes, but it took a long time for the society to accept and adjust to it, and then finally it did.
It's still, and it still hasn't been fully adjusted. I mean, I do a lot of public interest law work, and we still have rules that essentially penalize women of color for the same sexual behavior that middle class and upper middle class women do. We still have different standards. And that's something that is going to still take a long time to undo.
You treat in the book also two other main, very important issues. One is obscenity and the other is pornography, especially in the public places. And now with the evolution of smartphones and the texting that has become sexting with the teenagers and others, that also is, of course, impacting evolution as well. What is acceptable and not acceptable is also changing. Why don't we first look into obscenity, how that has become, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and legally where we stand.
Well, as anyone with a computer can tell you, there's absolutely no problem in accessing pornography of any stripe in a matter of seconds. But that doesn't mean we still don't have obscenity laws, and the obscenity laws are still not selectively enforced. What we have, really, obscenity laws have become sort of like vagrancy laws, in the sense that they're laws that are honored, that are breached, millions of times a day, but are there for the government to selectively enforce when it deems it opportune to do so. Okay? So obscenity remains sort of part of the toolkit against social deviance in one form or another. And I have this remarkable example in the book about this gentleman in Florida, where you are, who ran a pornography website out of his apartment and offered free access to any soldiers who were serving in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the site became sort of a gathering place for a lot of soldiers who would post pictures of themselves with their buddies, at their barracks, or just post pictures of themselves. But then they began to post pictures of Iraqi casualties and children who were killed by American soldiers, and a lot of the real gruesome aspects of the wars that somehow never made it onto our television screens. And the minute that happened, the tight control of information coming out of those wars began to crack. And they used a pornography prosecution against the guy to really not stop the pornography, but to stop soldiers from posting these pictures on this site. And so we use pornography laws very, very selectively. Also, what I find interesting is as pornography became liberalized, starting in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and as a lot of the rules began to loosen up, there began to be this sort of unholy alliance between far-left feminists and extreme-right evangelicals, both of whom find pornography to be inherently harmful. Okay, essentially a reaction against the sexualizing of society itself. And so we still have pushing for rules against pornography and to get courts to accept that pornography can cause violence and cause rape. Pornography still remains kind of a touchstone for the sexuality of society generally. And then there's also one more thing is before the internet, child pornography, that is pornography using children as objects, was pretty well wiped out. But with the internet, that has been revived many times over. So a paying customer in Paris or New York can pay to watch a child molested in, say, the Philippines or in Thailand. And so it becomes very easy to use the internet to exploit children, and that becomes a huge challenge for law enforcement to stop that. So as the internet has made pornography banal in many ways, so that there's so much of it, no one wants to see it, really. There's nothing spicy about it anymore. At the same time, it's given leash to some of the real darker forces of society, and it's poses all kinds of new challenges. Finally, when children, that is now we have children defined as people under 18, exchange images of themselves to each other, which they do over and over and over again, under the current regime of law, they become child pornographers with themselves as the exploited parties. So a 16-year-old girl or boy who will send a picture of herself or himself to a boyfriend or girlfriend, that person has become under federal law, a child pornographer. And shocking as it is, there's been quite a few prosecutions. Now, I think we could probably find our way to fix the law to keep people from being held as criminals for exploiting themselves. But what about when a picture becomes resent and reposted and used to torment others? Say that a girl sends a picture of herself to her boyfriend. They're no longer boyfriend and girlfriend. That boy starts to use his picture to torment the girl. That's revenge, something called revenge porn. I don't really understand it. I don't understand how anybody could send a picture of themselves to someone else, but millions of people do. And so we have this storehouse of pictures held by people who are not pornographic actors or actresses, but are doing it in private, that these pictures become public. And there's a very quick move now to find a way to outlaw what's called revenge porn, which is the use of pornography to torment somebody else. And there are very sticky issues in that. There are First Amendment issues. It's very, very difficult. It's a very difficult thing. And lawmakers are really struggling right now to put their heads around this. But I think we're going to see a lot more people who are harmed and a lot more efforts by legislatures and governments to try and find a way to balance people's free use of their phones and free use of their private relationships with the potential for torment. And none of this could have existed before the internet made the exchange of such images so easy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So in conclusion, which you have a nice chapter in the book, where do we stand and where the envelope is and where you think we are heading in the next 5 years?
Well, I think anyone who tries to predict the future is has a high risk for appearing the fool. But I think that a lot of us people on the coast are perhaps fooling ourselves in thinking that a lot of these issues, such as issues of gender and sexuality and homosexuality, have now been wrapped up and are, put away. I think, as we see with these transgender issues that are being litigated now in public and discrimination issues, I think those are not going to go away. I think the whole notion of what makes a child and what are the rules, how should the rules differ between people who are under 18 and over 18? I think we're still going to struggle with that quite a bit. And I think also as the world shrinks and as the internet makes the world sort of one unified organism, a lot of these rules are going to be played out much more on the international stage and much less on the local stage. And if we've seen anything, we've seen that international agreements are often not enforced. So that's really it. I think that the counter reaction to the sexual revolution on both the far left and the far right is far from exhausted. And a lot of the aspects of the sexual revolution have led towards a lot of harm towards people, but at the same time, the notion of balancing individual freedom, individual prerogative with the welfare of society generally, there's going to be 100 new ways in which those basic issues are going to be worked out, and I don't think we're ever going to reach some kind of consensus.
You have a very interesting title of the book, Changing Identities. How did that get in the title, if you would explain that? And what does it really signify?
Sex is sort of at the flashpoint between law and power and a person's personal identity. We have now come to a point where one's sexuality is actually a very important component of who we are and how we present ourselves. And so the identity as, say, homosexual, or the identity as rape victim, or for example, we now have sex offender lists that have more than 1 million people on them. They are now given an identity by the government as to something that they've done. So sex has become sort of an essential aspect of one's identity, both personally and outwardly. And that's really what I meant, is that people's identities change and evolve along with the law. Now, do their identities change because of the law, or does the law change their identities? Is it going one way or the other? I say both. And so there really is no eternal sex law, and there really is no eternal set of sexual moralities. They change constantly. And that's really what I meant.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to listen to you and hear your views and how the book has come about. So it will be also very interesting to our listeners a little bit understand about you. How did you get involved in this topic, and how your career has evolved in the last 20-25 years? And if you would explain who is Eric Berkowitz?
Eric Berkowitz is, I've been an attorney for 30 plus years. And I'm also a journalist. I have a master's in journalism, and I publish quite a bit in magazines and various publications. And about 5, 6, 7 years ago, I got the harebrained idea of writing a general, interesting, story-based history of the law. And I very quickly realized what a terrible idea that was. It was way too broad, but I did investigate some of the earliest laws, and I realized that from the very beginning, I'm talking from the Mesopotamians 5,000 years ago, that sex was one of the main preoccupations of the law. I never intended to write 2 books. This is, Boundaries is my second book on the subject. The first one covered prehistory to about 1900. Boundaries covers 1900 to the present day. But I realized that how we relate to each other sexually has always been a main preoccupation of the law, because it's a defining feature of humanity, and it's a defining limit to how far the government and the law can intrude or define who we are. And so I decided to follow that particular thread, starting with the Mesopotamians, and see where it took me. And it ended up with the first book called Sex and Punishment, and now I've just published the second one. As for my legal practice, I do a lot of human rights law. I represent asylum seekers here in the United States. I do a lot of poverty law, although my background was really in intellectual property and commercial litigation. What always interests me is the story, is the humanity behind all this. Laws themselves are rather dry affairs, but there's always a lot of human drama behind it, and there's always a living, breathing human being behind all these cases. And my goal was to take what I was reading in a lot of dusty law books and breathe new life into it, and to find the drama and the tears and the laughter and the warmth behind a lot of these stories. And maybe, hopefully, somehow help us understand ourselves a little bit better in the process.
Are you working on any other new book projects or?
Yeah, I am, but they're secret at this point.
Oh,
I've got a new project that I'm working on, but you will be the first to know.
Oh, thank you. Now, currently you reside on the West Coast in California, or you?
I do. I live in San Francisco. Yes.
San Francisco. Mm-hmm. Well, if you do have another book, hopefully we would have an opportunity to talk to you again and have our listeners know more about your book as well, and hopefully it will gain a wider audience for your book as well.
I would love that, of course.
We've been speaking with Eric Berkowitz, the author of Boundaries of Desire, A Century of Good Sex, Bad Laws, and Changing Identities.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.